Hey class, this is part 6 of 6. This is our last teaching, our last lesson in the Kingdom, Exile, and Return series. And in fact, as we talked about in class on Sunday, this is actually our last lesson for a little bit. We are taking a break from course classes through the Advent season at least, and probably well into January as well. This is going to be our last one for a little bit, but hopefully we'll be circling back around and jumping back into the New Testament the next time that we're together. So let's go ahead and jump right in to our last lesson here. We have been talking, obviously, about the exile the last couple of weeks, and we have tried to make a point that through the difficulty, through the suffering, through the pain, through the anguish that the people are experiencing, they're crying out consistently to God, saying, "Where are you? What is going to happen to us?" And God eventually, after kind of letting them sit a little bit in the tension of what some of those questions are getting at, God is going to come and begin to instill a sense of hope. He's going to begin to make promises that they will be taken care of, that they will be saved from the situation. And in fact, in the book of Jeremiah, he promises that he will actually restore their nation. He will restore the nation of God back to himself. Okay, now here we are. We are still within the exile. We're going to talk about that here in just a second. But we're in a later stage of exile that we're going to call now the return. Because while some people are going to remain in exile, the events that we read about in this week's passages and stories are now going to begin to usher in a new era where people are going to be able to return home. Okay, so first big point, what is going on in this? What's the key theme? What's the key lesson to take out of this part of Scripture? Number one, it's that God is bringing his people back from exile and returning them to the promised land. One point that I want to make about this. The interesting way that it happens, because it's done in a very, very different way, in a lot of ways, from anything that God has done before in the history of the people of Israel. On the other hand, it actually has some similarities to things that God has done in their history, and we'll talk about that in a second. But first, let's focus on the difference. This is going to be done through the pagan ruler of the Persian Empire. Very different from like saving the people from slavery in Egypt, right? Where the Egyptian Pharaoh opposes God, opposes letting the people go. And Moses, an Israelite, is called by God and empowered by God then to lead the people out. We have a very opposite thing happening here where God bypasses using the Israelites and goes right to King Cyrus of Persia and gives him the vision, gives him the urging, the beckoning to let the people go. And it's Cyrus who brings about all of this and makes this decree that the people may go back and rebuild the temple and rebuild their city and their nation. Where is this similar? Well, this does continue if you think back to, say, the book of Daniel. I think there's a lot of parallels here between this book and the book of Daniel, because in the book of Daniel, we saw various Babylonian and then eventually Persian kings being confronted with the reality of the sovereignty and the power of Daniel's God, the Hebrew God, the one and only creator God, but them being pagan, them being polytheistic and worshiping all these other deities. They're confronted with this reality and they say, this God is to be worshipped, right? I will follow and obey this God. Now, I don't think it lasts very long. I think in their pagan roots, it's so difficult for them to leave that, and they eventually begin to do things that oppose the Hebrew God as well. But these moments, these glimpses that we see in the Persian rulers and in the Babylonian rulers, fast forward to now in the return, and I think that this is continuing this theme that God can use anyone to bring about his purposes. And in fact, he does. He's going to use people who don't even consistently believe in him or follow him to bring about his purposes for his own people. Another point that I want to make on this point is, and I want to kind of layer this on top. If we're going to apply this to us today in a modern Christian setting, I think that the lesson that can apply very, very easily from this time and is a continuous theme scripturally and in the world as a whole, is that even when it seems like the world, the outside world, the world that opposes God, has the upper hand, God is always and will still be, from this moment forward, in control. God is sovereign. God is in control. God has not lost a grip on the situation, even when it sometimes feels that way. Another point I want to make. God keeps his promises even when it seems like he might not. Because we want to go back to that tension that people were feeling, the questions they were asking. Remember, they said, has God abandoned us? Has God left us to our own devices? Has he said, you've gone too far now, Israel? Your disobedience, your turning away from me has gone too far, and now I just leave you. I desert you. I abandon you. I forsake you forever. The answer now we see is a resounding no. No, God says. No. There's nothing you can do to separate yourself from my love, ultimately. I am still going to be here for my people, despite and maybe even because of their disobedience and because of their tendency to spurn me and turn away from me. So what then is being restored here as we think about what God is doing? And we think about, from the time of the exile, some of the key themes that we highlighted. What are the things that the people lost when they were whisked away from their homes and brought into Babylon, brought into Assyria, if we're talking about the northern kingdom of Israel? What was it they lost? They lost their home. They lost land. They lost possessions. They lost freedom, right? They were treated as second-class citizens, as even kind of like servants. And ultimately, maybe the key thing that they felt like they lost was God's presence. The temple was destroyed. This is the center. This is the place where God dwells. This is the place where they go to connect with and worship their God. And the temple is no more. It's rubble. It's ruins. It's been ransacked by the Babylonians. And they're taken away from there. They're taken away from the center of God's presence amongst them as a people. But these are all the things now that are being restored as they get to go back, right? Home, land, possessions, all coming back. Freedom, autonomy, no longer feeling like you're second-class citizens and you're slaves serving another people group. Now, of course, unfortunately, this is going to be kind of a rug that gets pulled back out from under their feet because it's not going to last very long. There are going to be other people groups that come in and take them over. But for the time being, this feels, at least to them, like freedom is being restored and God's presence. They're going to be able to rebuild the temple, the central place of worshiping their God. This is all very, very big, very important stuff. And let me say what I think perhaps one of the big keys to this entire section of Scripture is. And that's that this is a new Exodus. There's so many comparisons that we're going to be able to make between the return and the Exodus. One of them is very, very blatantly shown to us, right? When it makes a comment that the people are pillaging and pilfering and being able to take the possessions of the Babylonians to go home. This is decreed by the king. He says, here, take all this. Take all the stuff we stole from the temple. Take it back with you. All the gold, all the silver, and restore it and use it to rebuild your temple and restock it. Just like the people plundered Babylon. Plundered the people of Egypt. So they're plundering Babylon here, just like they plundered the people of Egypt in the book of Exodus. This is going to be a key, and I'm going to circle back to this. So hold on to the thought that this is a new Exodus for the people, because we're going to come back to hit that, and I'm going to show you why I think it's the most important thing here in just a second. Okay, so the building of the new temple is underway, and it requires the law to be re-examined very, very closely. I think this is a very key point and theme in the scripture. Many people are brought to joyful worship. It says that there is dancing, there's singing, there's people shouting for joy as the foundation is laid of the new temple. And this is a natural and a good way to respond to seeing God fulfill his promises. I think this is a great scene to picture in our minds and to picture what would this have been like for us to be able to take part in something like this. And I can only imagine, feeling a sense of like God fulfilling his promises to the point that I cannot help but just erupt into joyful worship of him. And this is something for us as Christians to think about today. Why can we not? Have not we been given faithful promises from God that would make us respond in this same way? I think that we have, but this is something I think for all of us, including me, to work on more is what does just letting yourself erupt in joyful, authentic worship feel like, and allowing that to happen within us. However, some of the people erupt in joyful worship. That is true. But not everyone. Did you see this? Wasn't this an interesting statement, an interesting passage in the scripture? Because it tells us that some of the people, especially the ones who were old enough to remember what the temple was like the first time, are actually sad. They erupt in wailing and crying and sobbing. And they're upset. Why? Because they believe that this one will not measure up. This is not the same, they say. We were here before. We experienced. We saw the city flourishing, laid out, looking like an actual city. Now we've come back, and this is not what we remember. Sure, we have the task of rebuilding and starting over, but it's not the same. It doesn't feel the same. There's a sense of unrealized hopes and dreams that all has not quite been made right yet by God. And I think this is also an important thing, an important and helpful way to see the world, not just focusing and being happy about the way that things are, but also noticing the ways that it's not living up to what God expects and the way that God hopes things will be. And allowing yourself to feel sadness and grief at that is a natural human response and a natural human emotion. Okay, let's move to the opposition. This was a key moment. So we're in Ezra chapter 4 here. In Ezra chapter 4, opposition is going to arise and attempt to thwart Israel's plans to rebuild and remake the temple. The first thing that happens is these people come to the Israelites and they say, hey, we see what you're doing. It looks interesting. Can we help? Can we help you rebuild the temple that you're working on? We would love to help you with this. And Israel says, no way. No, this is our calling. God has called us to do this because we are actually believers in this. Like, you guys you don't believe in this temple. You don't believe in our God. And this is our undertaking, and this is God has especially consecrated and chosen us to do this job, and it's not for you. It kind of comes across a little bit harsh, to be honest, at least to me at first when I read it, until I kind of dug in a little bit deeper. But what's going on here? God is calling his people to reject the help. I'm going to put help in quotes here. To reject the help of pseudo-believers who may have alternate plans, alternate ideas for this alliance that they're supposedly seeking. Specifically, those alternate plans, as we're going to see when they write the letter and try to get this thing stopped, is control and power. Now, to me, this is an easy application for Christians today. Because do we not face a system in the world, these groups of people that know that Christians are an important base of potential power and control, and attempt to use that and misuse that for their own purposes? I'll let your mind run and think about what that would look like for you. For me, the application here is the political system in general. And I'm not talking about any specific part of the political system. I'm talking about all of it. Every side of the political system that we now have is so power hungry that they would absolutely co-opt a contingent of Christians and Christianity in any voting group if they thought they would bring them more power and more control. And I think as Christians, we at the very least must be very, very careful about allowing ourselves to be co-opted and used in that way. Okay. Another key point, probably actually the most fundamental point that we could make in this whole section, is that even within the enactment of God's plan, even when things seem like they're going good, and the way that God has intended them to be and to go, there's going to be trouble and there's going to be strife in this world. As long as we are living in a fallen world, we're going to encounter difficulty and pain and opposition and struggle. And there's no way around it. There's no way of getting out of that. So the question then that follows that statement up would be, how then can the people remain faithful? If this is, how can we remain faithful? How can these people remain faithful if they are facing a reality of continued hardship, continued struggle, continued pain? How can they continue to follow God and be faithful to God despite going through these difficult times? Here's where I want to circle back, because I believe that the key point and the key statement, possibly the main idea of this entire section of Scripture, is that God has very intentionally tried to make the people see that this is indeed a new Exodus. And why would I say that? What's important about God saying this is a new Exodus for the people? Think about the Exodus and what happened during that time period. It was a time of immense struggle, immense pain, immense hardship on the part of the people. And God came, entered into that with the people, and pulled them out, right? God saved them. God was faithful during that time and brought them to the place where he had promised to take them all along, the promised land, out of their slavery into the promised land. But there was hardship along the way. Remember, the desert, all of the pain and suffering and the wandering in the desert. But God was still with them, and he was faithful to the promise. He brought them, even despite that difficulty, to the place where he had always promised to take them, to be loved and guided and forgiven by the almighty creator of the universe, This is where the story goes. This is the ultimate ending of the story. And now we find ourselves reading about this people group. God has brought them back. It looks like things are going well, just as God had saved them from Egypt. And now they're going to encounter hardship. They're going to encounter struggles. They're going to face all this opposition that's trying to get them either arrested or certainly to get their progress stopped. And they're going to say, I remember something like this before. God was faithful during the Exodus. And this feels a lot like the Exodus in many, many ways. And God's going to be faithful to us again, isn't he? That's the whole point. That's why God wanted them to make these connections to the Exodus, so that they would see, I'm still with you. I'm still in charge. I'm still sovereign, and I will be faithful to my people. Do not give up your hope in me and your trust and faith in me. But it is also important to recognize that the people were not faithful. Yes, God gave them every chance to be faithful, and he gave them the reasons why they could be faithful and just push through, because you know I'm with you and I am for you. But the people fail. The people are not faithful. And in fact, I did not assign the reading of the book of Nehemiah, but the book of Nehemiah also takes place within the return. Nehemiah is actually a contemporary of Ezra, but after the fact. So he comes in at the end of Ezra's time period. And what Nehemiah is going to come in, and this is after God has restored the building plan. He has defeated the opposition. At the end of the book of Ezra that you guys read, you saw that, like, yes, the trouble arose and they made them stop, but then they were able to go back and they were able to rebuild it. After all of that, Nehemiah comes to help the people and join the project. And he finds the people using the materials to make their own houses bigger and better. They're not using the materials any longer for the rebuilding of the temple. They're using them for themselves. And Nehemiah's like, are you kidding me? What are you doing? The people are not faithful. We'll pause there, because that's going to lead to more questions, right? Well, now what? If the people have not remained faithful even now, then what now? Pause on that. We're gonna get to that in just a second, and we get to the book of Malachi. Really quickly back to Ezra. When Ezra arrives and helps to oversee this project, his first suggestion, and I think this is really a key point, is to open the scriptures. He says, we have to consult the law if we want to do this correctly. We need to know what God's story is so that we'll be able to find and see what God is doing here. There's a really power to being able to go to the past in order to have hope for the future. And Ezra, I think, really helps the people to do that in telling them we must stay in the scriptures. We must consult them. That must be the basis and foundation for everything that we're doing in this project. Okay, so book of Malachi. Now we find God has already overcome Israel's enemies through a crazy roundabout turn of events. The people are allowed to once again commence the rebuilding of the temple and the city of Jerusalem. But there's still a problem. And the problem that we've already highlighted, just as Nehemiah found, is not external, actually. The ultimate problem is internal for God's people. Israel is actually, in essence, its own worst enemy. And the start of the book of Malachi is going to detail for us all the ways that this is true. The people have not been faithful to God. They have not sacrificed their best animals. Malachi tells us they've been taking lame animals that they didn't even want to eat anyway. And that's what they use in their sacrifices and their worship to God. The priests who are in charge of leading the people in worship, Malachi tells us they are absolutely failing at this duty. They are turning the people away from the right worship of God with the way they are leading the people. People have been turning once again to foreign gods and foreign peoples, and they're no longer even tithing to the temple. They're no longer giving any money for the upkeep of the temple, for the taking care of the priests. It's bad. And if we think about where Israel has come from, we think about that the exile seemed to be kind of God's last resort, right? It's like, this is the one way that I'm going to attempt to bring you back and help you see the error in your ways. Because the worst thing that God could possibly do is just allow the people on this slow, steady decline down into their own doom and destruction and eternal separation from God. And God says, I can't let you do that. I must wake you up. I must do something. And he chooses exile. He brings them back, and the people fail again. This is a worst-case scenario. I mean, what's God going to do next? What could possibly be worse than the slavery and exile that the people have already been forced to experience as a result of their disobedience and their ignoring of God? What could God possibly do? He's already said he wouldn't just destroy everyone with another flood, but maybe he needs to start over again. Maybe destruction is necessary. Maybe God needs to wipe the people out and start all over again. When we get to Malachi, the end of the book of Malachi, we find God saying, you know what, you're right. I do need to make one last decision. We have to fix this ultimately once and for all. I do have to do something drastic. And God says, the drastic thing I am going to do is I will come. I will come. I will come to you, my people, and I will rescue you. I will refine you. I will purify you from the inside out. And you will see, you will know that I am coming when you see a messenger go before me. And it will be Elijah, God says. This is going to be a crazy turn of events, because if we get back to the New Testament and we see John the Baptist, who is the fulfillment of the one who comes before God to pave the way for him in the Gospels, and we find the religious leaders asking John, are you Elijah? And that seems like a super weird question to ask him, but now we see why. Because the book of Malachi says, Elijah will come, and he will pave the way for me to come and finally make things right once and for all. Of course, we know what this is prophesying and how this is made true in the life of Jesus Christ. And what a great way to end with a little note of hopefulness through this section of the kingdom, exile, and return. And this will certainly pave our way very, very well into re-examining the New Testament and specifically the Gospels in our next section. That's it for now. Thank you guys so much for being along for the ride with me to this point. I really hope that when we get back into the Gospels in our next section that you'll be there. And that's it for now. I hope you guys have a great Thanksgiving and a wonderful Christmas season and Advent season. And I hope to see you soon. Bye for now.